welcome to the Halaba Fantasy Football League. This is your semi-final recap. Unlike last week, we got way more drama in our fantasy football games today, so that was pretty awesome. It was enjoyable. Like, even for the rest of us who aren't in it, it was fun to watch you guys try to battle it out. Today's drink is an old-fashioned. So can't go wrong with this. Let's see. We can just do a quick rundown of everybody's teams because there are some pretty interesting storylines and trends. If you look at Morgan versus Gary, Gary beats out Morgan. I don't know if anybody's really playing, but good strong quarterback play from both of these guys. The big ones that are most notable on Gary's side is Cam Akers getting 36 points as the Rams just stomped all over Denver. They did it so badly that Nathaniel Hackett is now no longer the coach. It's not entirely all his fault, but he did not help his case. He was gift wrapped at a good team. They gave him Russell Wilson, who is a Super Bowl quarterback, but for whatever reason, none of that worked. And then for Morgan, most notable is Dak Prescott scoring big, plus over 30 points on this game, but his team mostly being healthy. So that's these two teams. And then, like I said, some of the notable things is guys that you expect to do good this week did not perform well. Like in Gary's case, Mark Andrews didn't do so hot. Aaron Jones, pretty bad. Dylan was actually the way better running back at that point. Maybe they're flip-flopping going forward. On Morgan's side, I don't know. I think it's pretty good. He didn't have one of those uncharacteristically bad games from the heavy hitters. The next up matchup, Brownsville Jets versus Brad. Super Mixon. For Mike, he got Tua Tagovailoa, and he looked bad in the second half of that game. Eckler actually did good, and this had an impact. Eckler actually had an impact on one of the semifinal games. We'll get to it in a minute, but just he was vulturing touchdowns, which helps Gary, but it does not help the playoff teams. And then for Brad, Gardner Minshew, nice pickup. Turns out this backup was one of the best quarterbacks that you played all year. Hard for Brad, who got suckered into taking Russell Wilson, just like the rest of Bronco Nation, but that's okay. You're not the only one. It's just a tough break to ride with Russell Wilson. Let's ride. Okay, next up, Darren versus James. For Darren, he had a pretty good pickup off the bench of a couple of guys, like James Cook, 18 points. That's a pretty good. Like, I think James Cook going forward should be a guy, like, I don't know. He seems way faster to me than Singletary, but I don't know. They're succeeding, so whatever. And then for James' team, look at the bottom half of it. His flex spot and his tight end spot. Kittle getting 27 points and CeeDee Lamb having 29 points. Those are some heavy hitters, and his bench quarterback actually scored way more than Tom Brady. For James, had he switched some things around, like here's the other one, right? Hopkins is another guy who you were expecting to do pretty good, but he didn't. But these other guys did well, and because of that, James would have been a super dangerous team in the playoffs had he just made it in. We always seem to have one of those guys, and this year it's James. And then the final consolation matchup is Don versus Mike L. Mike L outscores me, and then I had a lot of those kind of like down games, like Fields having only 12 points, and then I should have played Trevor Lawrence instead. And on my bench, Deontay Foreman, him and Chuba Hubbard, man, they just went off against the Detroit D, just gashing them on the ground. And then for Mike L, Leonard Fournette had a good game, and that might have had an impact on one of the semifinal games because one of the semifinalists had Rashad White, and most of those carries were going to Fournette. So it may have had an impact. But yeah, so those are the consolation games. Now we can get to the actual playoff games. Yeah, like I said, these were certainly much more interesting than last week. Last week were kind of like early blowouts and not very interesting in terms of them being competitive, but these games actually had some drama. The first one was Prince Lama Eric versus Aaron riding with my homies. They had their game was decided by yesterday, but the drama leading up to that decision was very, very interesting. Aaron seemed to have had this, like you see the original projections, 129.43, 124.75, so closely matched, but Aaron was slightly favored. And early on, if you watch the games, Aaron kind of set his score early, and it came down to like what the Denver D was going to do in the end. So he had strong games across the board from his big guns, right? He had the anti-bad week from a lot of the heavy hitters. Mahomes 25, Justin Jefferson 25, Higgins 22, Saquon Barkley 24.7. Enough to carry like kind of down games from Zay Jones, J.K. Dobbins, and Bass, right? Denver was the final piece. And Eric had a game to try to like close the gap, and it was the afternoon game, I believe. It was Green Bay versus Miami, and they had Jalen Waddle, and he had Jalen Waddle. And if you saw the whole entirety of the game, you would think that Miami did not do well because of how badly Tua played in the second half. But early in the game, Jalen Waddle broke out this like 80-plus yard touchdown catch and run. And that just gave him all the points that he needed to try to build as big as a cushion as he could. And he just balled out, right? 22 points. And then Eric had like we said, maybe he doesn't win because of guys like Deontay Johnson only getting 8.9, or especially someone like Josh Jacobs having only 7 points. And then questioning like, why didn't he play Devontae Smith, who had 27 points, or Ingram, who had 14.8 points, even though Taysom Hill did pretty decently. But yeah, Eric was able to build this 129.8 lead, and what that would lead to is Denver. So as soon as you hit that opening bell of that game with Denver on Sunday Night Football, he gets the automatic 10 points. That puts him like within a point of Eric. It gets him to like 128 point whatever. That's how close the score was at the beginning. And so at that point, right, it's a coin flip. Either goes one way or the other. Denver either loses points and then Eric slowly increases his lead, or Denver does a big, gets some turnovers, does pretty well defensively, and he gets over 10 points and he can pull out the win. It didn't work out that way. And this was kind of a wild one because if you look at what Aaron had on his bench, he had the Buffalo D, who had 12 points. Had he started the Buffalo D in place of Denver, it's not just a 12-point differential, mind you. It's plus the minus 3.9 points that Denver fielded. So that's 15 plus points there, right? And what that would have yielded Aaron is 130.36. That's 0.56 points over Eric had he just played the Buffalo D. So it's really, really interesting decision on Aaron's part. And he's probably kicking himself for it because it would have given him a win. And in this case, like, right, Denver D is pretty good. They are a good defense. And Rams have been up and down. But Buffalo is a quality team. What Denver is not a quality team. And it looked like he was going for chaos. Maybe, Aaron, was that your strategy? Because it was two bottom feeders, right? You have Denver, and then you have the Rams going head to head, and maybe there's some bad plays on both sides, and there's like fumbles and interceptions, and maybe that's what you're counting on. Well, that did happen, but it mostly happened on the other side, because if you had chosen the Rams, they would have had more points. And in fact, I believe the Rams had the most defensive points of the week. So you chose the right game, LA versus Denver. But you chose the wrong team of that game, because Denver had the worst defensive score of the entire week, minus 3.9. I think they even beat Detroit's minus 3.4 or something. So you could have chosen any. I mean, it wasn't an easy thing, right? There were only 5 defensives that scored just enough for you to beat them. The heartbreaker for him is maybe not necessarily choosing the Rams, but you had that one of those teams on your bench. And like we said, this is going to be one of those coulda, woulda, shouldas. You may have gotten the win from this, but maybe it was overthinking. Maybe there was information, but it just didn't play out that way. But so, congrats to Aaron for making it this far and getting to the semifinals and nearly pulling off a win. But Eric, congratulations to Eric, who moves on to the title game, where he tries to go for his 4th title. So he was one of the 3-time champions. So let's move to the last game of the week, Blitz and Ritz versus Mediocre Minions. And this was yet another game that had a lot of drama in it and was fun to watch. I was saying that it did go down to the Sunday night game, and it did go down to the two teams, like the Colts versus the Chargers. And that actually, I appreciate that. When you have two guys going head to head and it coincides with that final game of the week, it does make that game a lot more interesting to watch. And that game it turned out to be a pretty bad game in terms of watching, and that's mostly the Colts' fault. But it did provide some intrigue for this final semifinal match. Yeah, so let me say, how can we build this up? Jeremy had a big lead early on, and like we said, there's a lot of guys like Stephon Diggs is another one of those who's a top 3 receiver, but he only had 3.6 points. At least guys like Henry held their own. But in spite of that, he had a pretty substantial lead that Richie had to fight to gain. And Richie's games were actually in a later game. He had them in the what game were they? I think they were Sunday night. Were they Sunday night football games? Yeah, they were Sunday night football games. He had Godwin. He had James Conner. He had Rachaad White. So he had these 3 guys, and even with what they were projected, they were still not enough for them to take over what Jeremy was projected to have. And it was just like last week when Richie played me, where the drama didn't happen until late into that Sunday night football game, because it was a pretty bad game as well. That was a tough game to watch, watching Tampa Bay versus Arizona. 2 very bad offenses. Arizona has Chase McSorley, so he's I don't know. At least Richie had pretty good play from Jared Goff. That's a guy who he picked up late, and he is riding all the way to the title game. So that's one of the solid moves that he played. There were some guys on the bench that could have done him really well, helped him out a little more had this game been gone the other way. Travis Etienne was actually one of the better backs, and McLaurin had a surprisingly 15.7 point game. But speaking of that, to close the gap against Jeremy, he had to have good games from Godwin, Connor, and Rachaad White. And so there was always, no matter who had the ball, there was always a guy who could produce points for them. The only problem is it didn't happen until later in the game. And it wasn't until they had like a touchdown for Connor. Connor got a touchdown. And then on the next possession, Rachaad White got a touchdown. And this was after, like we were saying, they were feeding the ball to Leonard Fournette the whole time, and they're like, "What's gonna happen to White?" It was tough, but because of that touchdown, it saved him and got him those big points. And he almost actually gave a knockout punch, because there was a late throw to Godwin, so he almost had the trifecta of of all three of those guys scoring touchdowns, but it hit him in the hands, and it was a tough catch to grab, but it was a touchdown throw that just was not caught. But at least he had one more play, and that was Chase McLaughlin, which sets up the Monday night game. So it would be McLaughlin versus Herbert. And as you can see, Herbert had a projected 23.58 points. And at this point, you can see that he only had 10.4 points. Just not what was expected. Like we said, what you expect of these guys, and when they don't deliver and it costs you a playoff game, that's exactly what happened to Jeremy. And it's the way it happened too. It was super painful. Like if you watch how badly that game was, Herbert had like negative points because he would throw a touchdown. I mean, not a touchdown, an interception, and then he would get sacked, and then he would get like, yeah, it's just those turnovers getting him negative. Like in the beginning of the game, he had negative points because of how bad it was in the beginning, and he lost the fumble too. That was another one. But it wasn't like they were playing bad. It was just the way it was set up. It was them versus the Colts, who has a strong D, horrible offense, and then he just kept getting vultured. Make it down into the red zone, kick a field goal. Make it down into the red zone, Eckler scores a touchdown. Make it down into the red zone, Eckler scores a touchdown. Make it down, can't get it, punch it in, gotta kick another field goal. So it was a tough one because they ended up they didn't need Herbert to be great, and that hurts Jeremy because Eckler was just running hard, and because of that lead, when you play with a lead, you don't have to pass as much. You just have to run the ball. And at that point, it becomes just like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Just keep handing off the ball to Eckler, handing off the ball to Kelly. And when you get into the end zone, just keep running it in until it gets in there. They didn't need any touchdown throws. But it had that air of like, he just needed that one touchdown pass to go for a touchdown, and that would have given him just enough to at least close the gap and maybe turn the tides on this, but it never came. And like we said, death by 1,000 paper cuts. Just keep running the ball, and touchdowns, just getting vultured. Now this is another interesting one where shoulda, woulda, coulda. Had he played Aaron Rodgers, who had 17.42, versus Justin Herbert, it would have been a different outcome too. This way, not as obvious, right? I think 9 times out of 10, most people who have both of these guys would have started Herbert ahead of Aaron Rodgers. So he's not going to lose sleep over this like Aaron is losing sleep over starting the Denver D over Buffalo's D. But had he played him, the score would have been 119.5 Richie to 119.74 to Jeremy. So had he played Aaron Rodgers there, he would have beat him by a differential of 0.24. So both of these shoulda, woulda, couldas less than a point. But it shows, sometimes that's the way fantasy goes. That's the reason why it makes it interesting, is we never know. You never know. You hope to get guys that are consistent enough to give you enough points to win. And sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes it does. And that's the case for Richie, who makes his first final in the Halava Fantasy Football League. So congrats to Richie. This is his second year, right? So this is another one of those. Like, I think this has happened a few times, but to be able to go to the title game this early in your career is pretty awesome. And never take it for granted, because there's guys in our league who still have not made it, or have made it but have not won at all. So congrats to Richie. He makes it as a bubble team who was a 7-7-0 and makes it all the way to the finals. There's always one guy like that. And he goes up against Eric, and he prevents this Dynasty Bowl that we probably could have had, because both Jeremy and Eric have 3 titles. And that would have made sure that at least we would have one 4-time title winner. But in this case, Richie's going to try to knock down both 3-time winners next week. So it'll be exciting to go next week. So thanks for making it interesting, and we look forward to our championship game next week.